The parade grounds stretched wide under a pale Colorado sky, the morning sun just high enough to throw sharp angles across the ranks of assembled soldiers. 317 men and women stood at attention, their uniforms immaculate, boots gleaming, eyes fixed on the raised platform where today's training demonstration would unfold. The chatter that usually accompanied gatherings of this size had quieted to a hum, replaced by an undercurrent of expectation. Word of Master Sergeant Maya Chun's promotion and her legendary 83-second fight had traveled farther than anyone anticipated. Recruits whispered her name like a story told around campfires, and even veterans who had scoffed at her before now found themselves curious. Maya stood at the center, her stance relaxed but purposeful, radiating the calm authority of someone who had nothing left to prove, yet everything left to teach. Her dark hair was still tied back in regulation, her uniform pressed, her eyes steady as they swept across the sea of faces. She felt their anticipation, their hunger for proof that the legend was real. But she also felt the weight of the other eyes, watching the ones that didn't seek inspiration but weakness. Among them was Colonel David Briggs. Once, he had been her commanding officer. Now he was a hollowed-out shadow of his former authority, transferred to an administrative oversight position after his attempt to humiliate her in Conference Room B ended with his name whispered in disgrace. Officially, he was here as an observer, charged with ensuring that new training protocols were applied with transparency. In truth, Briggs had maneuvered himself onto the review panel for this event, hoping to reclaim a measure of control over a narrative that had slipped from his grasp. Maya didn't need to glance directly at him to know he was there. She felt his presence the way a soldier feels, the weight of an unseen sniper. Something in the air shifted when Briggs entered a space, turning it heavier, sharper, poisoned with intent. She had learned to trust that instinct, the whisper in her gut that said danger isn't always on the battlefield. Sometimes it wears a uniform with polished insignia. As she stepped forward to address the formation, her voice carried clear and even, cutting across the grounds with the assurance of command. She spoke of adaptability, of how combat wasn't about who hit hardest but who thought fastest. She demonstrated fluid movements with two recruits, disarming a mock blade in one motion and neutralizing a mock rifle with another. The soldiers leaned forward, the rhythm of the lesson pulling them in. But Briggs didn't watch to learn. His gaze was a dagger, and every motion she made only twisted it deeper into his pride. He saw her respect, her authority, her control over hundreds of soldiers, and it burned him from the inside. His jaw clenched, his hands locked behind his back too tightly to be casual. This wasn't observation, it was stagecraft. He was waiting for his moment. Maya caught it in flashes, the way he whispered to the officers near him, the calculated smirk when her back was turned, the faint scoff he didn't bother to hide when the crowd clapped at her precise takedown. He wasn't here to watch. He was here to bait. Her grandmother's words floated to the surface, as they always did when her pulse quickened. A river does not rush to meet a stone. It waits. And when the stone crumbles, the river is still flowing. So Maya let the hostility wash over her without reaction. She controlled her breathing, her movements, her tone, careful not to give him the satisfaction of an opening. The recruits saw only their instructor, calm and unshaken, but inside, her mind was already preparing. Briggs had failed to break her once, but humiliation is a seed that grows in silence. And today, under the eyes of 317 witnesses, he was going to try again. What he didn't yet understand was that the trap he thought he was setting was one she had already seen, already measured, already waiting to turn back on him the moment he revealed his hand. The air on the parade grounds was crisp, but heat simmered beneath the surface. Maya Chun moved with the precision of a surgeon, each demonstration unfolding with fluid grace and brutal efficiency. 3 recruits stepped forward in sequence, each one a head taller and nearly 50 pounds heavier than she was. Yet in seconds she stripped them of practice rifles, bent them into submission with pressure point holds, and redirected their own momentum into controlled falls that left the crowd murmuring in awe. Her voice carried evenly as she explained each movement. Size is not strength. Technique is strength. A calm mind is strength. Remember, an opponent expects you to fight their fight. Never give them what they expect. She held up a recruit's arm, applied a subtle twist, and had him on his knees before anyone could blink. Control is not about domination, it's about precision. The lesson landed, visible in the faces of the 317 soldiers standing at rigid attention, their eyes bright, their postures leaning just slightly forward, drawn in by the undeniable mastery before them. But not all eyes watched with admiration. Colonel Briggs stood at the edge of the demonstration circle, his hands clasped behind his back, his mouth curved in the faintest sneer. For long minutes he let her command the stage, let the weight of her competence fill the air. And then, like a knife cutting across silk, his voice interrupted. "Impressive theater, Sergeant. But that's all it is, isn't it? Theater." The words hung heavy. Soldiers shifted uneasily in formation, glancing toward him, then back at her. Briggs stepped forward, his boots grinding against the gravel. "We all know your so-called victories. 5 men in a room who fell exactly the way you wanted them to. Rumors say they went easy on you, didn't want to risk breaking you in half. Isn't that right?" A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. Maya kept her face neutral, but inside, a cold rage stirred. Briggs had chosen his moment carefully. He wasn't attacking her skill, he was attacking her legitimacy, and he was doing it in front of hundreds of witnesses. She opened her mouth to respond, but he raised a hand theatrically. "In fact," he said, shrugging off his jacket, "why don't we cut through the stories and see for ourselves? You say technique overcomes size? Intelligence overcomes strength? Then show us." He rolled his sleeves, his voice dripping with challenge. "Show these soldiers that your methods work on someone who isn't a compliant recruit." The silence that followed was suffocating. 317 soldiers stood frozen, caught between loyalty and fear. The demonstration circle suddenly felt like an arena. Maya shook her head. "This isn't training, sir. It's provocation. And it undermines the integrity of what we're here to teach." Briggs stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to force the soldiers to lean in. "What undermines integrity," he said, "is allowing a fraud to stand where warriors should. You're a political project, Chun. A box checked for diversity, nothing more." His words slashed through the formation like barbed wire. He didn't just target hair. He targeted every soldier who had ever been dismissed because of their size, their gender, their background. The crowd shifted, boots grinding on gravel, shoulders tightening. A few soldiers dropped their eyes, ashamed, while others glared at him openly. Maya's breath caught, her grandmother's voice echoing like a steadying hand. "The river does not seek the stone, but when the stone cracks, the river flows through." Walking away now would hand Briggs the narrative. He would spin it into weakness, claim she hid behind regulations and careful words. He wanted her cornered, but he had overplayed his hand. Maya straightened, her eyes locking on his. "If this is what you want, Colonel, then understand one thing," she said, her voice carrying like a shot across the grounds. "You're not just challenging me. You're challenging every soldier here who has ever been underestimated, and I won't let you speak for them." The silence shattered into a low rumble of voices, tension snapping taut like a drawn bow. The stage was no longer his. It belonged to both of them now, and everyone knew the next moment would decide who left with the truth and who left in pieces. The circle that formed around them was no longer a training demonstration but an arena, living and breathing with the energy of 317 soldiers. Boots shifted on gravel, rifles slung across shoulders leaned forward unconsciously, breaths held in collective silence. The air itself seemed to tighten as Colonel Briggs stepped fully into the center, rolling his shoulders, smirking like a man who already believed the outcome was set. His eyes narrowed, predatory and mean, the posture of a man who thought cruelty was strength. Maya stood opposite him, her hands loose at her sides, her weight distributed evenly across the balls of her feet. There was no fear in her face, no anger either, only the stillness of a soldier who had faced worse storms than this one. She let him pace, let him circle her like a wolf around prey. Every step he took, every shift in his shoulders, every flex of his jaw was logged, calculated, measured against the countless hours of combat that had written themselves into her bones. Briggs raised his voice, projecting to the crowd. "Watch closely, soldiers. This is why politics has no place in war. Technique doesn't beat brute force. Discipline doesn't beat raw power. You'll see soon enough." His words were met with silence, no applause, no laughter. Even those who had doubted Maya shifted uneasily, sensing arrogance masquerading as confidence. Then he lunged. It was a clumsy, angry strike, his arm sweeping forward in a wide arc, meant to catch her across the face, not to defeat her but to humiliate her, to make her stumble in front of hundreds of witnesses. His bulk carried him forward with reckless momentum, his center of gravity already spilling ahead of his body. To the untrained eye, it looked dangerous. To Maya, it looked like an open door. She moved at the last instant, her body slipping just out of line with the strike. Her left hand clamped down on his wrist, her right arm shooting up under his elbow, and with the fluidity of water meeting stone, she redirected all of his force against him. Briggs's own mass betrayed him, his shoulder twisted, his elbow overextended, his body off balance in a way he couldn't recover from. Then came the break. The sound was sharp and undeniable, like a dry branch snapping in two. It carried across the parade ground, echoing against stone walls, and into the stunned silence of the formation. Briggs dropped to the gravel, a strangled scream ripping from his throat, his arm bent at an unnatural angle that left no room for denial. His face contorted in pain, pride shattered as thoroughly as bone. For a heartbeat, the grounds were utterly still. Then the eruption came. Gasps, shouts, murmurs, phones, raised like a forest of witnesses capturing the impossible. Soldiers who had once doubted her now stared with eyes wide in shock, disbelief, and something dangerously close to reverence. Maya did not move to gloat. She did not sneer, or smirk, or raise her fists in triumph. She stood over him with her breathing steady, calm, her posture unchanged. To her, this wasn't victory. It was inevitability. She looked down at Briggs as though he were not a colonel, but a failed student, a man who had insisted on learning a lesson the hardest way possible. The soldiers in the circle felt it tooth reversal of power so complete it left no question. Maya Chun hadn't just won. She had dismantled a symbol of arrogance in front of every eye, and she had done it with the same composure she'd carried into battlefields half a world away. Briggs writhed in the dirt, his voice hoarse with pain, but the crowd wasn't watching him anymore. They were watching her. Phones recorded, eyes locked, hearts thundering with the sense that history had just been made in less than a breath. Maya let the silence linger, her eyes sweeping across the 317 soldiers who would carry this moment with them for the rest of their lives. She didn't need to speak. The broken arm at her feet had already said everything. The silence after the snap of bone was heavier than any gunfire Maya had ever known. For a long moment, the parade ground seemed suspended in time. Hundreds of soldiers stared, their faces caught between disbelief and awe, the only sound the ragged breathing of Colonel Briggs as he writhed in the gravel. Then the whispers began, a ripple moving through the ranks, quick and hushed, like the first gust of wind before a storm. Some soldiers couldn't hold it back. A few cheers broke through, raw and unguarded, while others simply shook their heads in stunned silence. Eyes darted to one another as if to confirm that yes, they had all just seen the same thing. 317 pairs of eyes bore witness to the moment a legend was cemented in flesh and bone. Maya stood still in the center, calm as stone, her posture unshaken. Her breathing remained steady, her hands loose at her sides. She hadn't moved to strike again, hadn't pressed the advantage. Instead, she looked at the circle of soldiers, her voice carrying across the grounds with quiet authority. "Strength isn't about size," she said, the words cutting through the air like steel. "It's about control, about discipline, and knowing when to end a fight before it begins." The murmurs stilled as the truth of her words settled over them. Even those who had doubted her, who had whispered that her reputation was built on exaggeration, now looked at her with something close to reverence. Briggs's arrogance had crumbled publicly, and Maya hadn't needed to gloat. She had simply shown them what was real. Military police pushed through the ring, their expressions tight as they crouched over the broken colonel, but their hands never reached for Maya. She watched them work, saw the way their eyes flicked toward her with the unspoken acknowledgement of what everyone else understood. She wasn't the criminal here. They lifted Briggs to his feet as gently as his shattered arm allowed and began escorting him away, his protests drowned by the recording phones raised high around the circle. The spectacle he had tried to stage had turned into evidence, and now it would live forever. By nightfall, the story had spread across the base like wildfire. Every barracks, every mess hall buzzed with the retelling. Phones replayed the video in grainy resolution, voices overlapping with shouts of disbelief. By morning, it had slipped beyond the base entirely, an unstoppable current coursing through social feeds, news wires, and inboxes across the military network. The woman who had ended 5 men in 83 seconds had just broken a colonel in front of 317 witnesses, and the world was watching. Maya was summoned within 24 hours. She entered the briefing room expecting sharp questions, accusations, perhaps even the beginning of formal charges. Instead, she was met with something else entirely. The generals seated across from her spoke with measured tones, but their eyes betrayed what their words tried to conceal: respect, commendation. They pressed her not about whether she had gone too far, but about how she had managed to maintain restraint when the situation could have spiraled into brutality. One of them leaned forward and said plainly, "The fact is, Sergeant, you did far less than you could have. That restraint speaks louder than any broken bone." She left the room without punishment, her record intact, her reputation elevated beyond anything she could have imagined. But as soldiers saluted her in the corridors, as recruits whispered her name with admiration, Maya felt the weight of something greater than glory. The real fight wasn't Colonel Briggs. It wasn't the 5 men she had dismantled before. It was the current that had carried them all into her path, the culture that still doubted, diminished, and dismissed anyone who didn't fit its narrow image of strength. Standing by the window of her quarters that night, the lights of Fort Carson glowing against the dark, Maya's reflection looked back at her in the glass. Calm, composed, unshaken. She knew this wasn't the end of the war, but every lesson, every demonstration, every soldier who left her training with new eyes was a victory. She had snapped an arm, but more importantly, she had broken an illusion that strength belonged only to the biggest, the loudest, the most aggressive. And with that truth echoing across the army, she vowed to keep pushing. One fight, one soldier, one lesson at a time.